So hello and welcome everyone. I'm delighted to have you all here, either virtually in our Zoom room live today or catching up on YouTube. Thank you all for joining us for this Tuesday Spotlight in May 2024. Today's lecture within our wider theme of Wonders of Egypt is entitled Tutankhamun, Excavating the Archive. And this will explore a first-hand account of Tutankhamun's discovery by Howard Carter and his team 150 years after Carter's birth, the anniversary of which is on the 9th of May 2024, later this week. So yes, I'm delighted to introduce our speaker, Dr. Daniela Rosenow, and who studied Egyptology and Classical Archaeology at the Humboldt University Berlin, where she obtained her doctorate on late period sacred architecture. She's worked at UCL's Institute of Archaeology, the British Museum, the University of Munich, and the German Archaeological Institute Cairo. In February 2021, Daniela joined the Griffith Institute, University of Oxford, where she was responsible for the curation of the exhibition Tutankhamun, Excavating the Archive, and is now the manager of the Griffith Institute. So I'm delighted to have you here, and on behalf of all of our audience, thank you very much for your presentation. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. I'm very happy to be here as well. And thanks for the kind introductory words. So as Charlotte just said, I am working at the Griffith Institute in Oxford right now. It's the Center of Egyptology at Oxford University, and we were established in 1939 thanks to an endowment that was made by Francis Llewellyn Griffith, who was the first professor for Egyptology in Oxford. And he basically bequeathed his estate to Oxford University with the stipulation to create a permanent home or an institute for the study of the ancient languages and antiquities of Egypt and the Near East. And so in addition to leading two major bibliographical research projects, the online Egyptological bibliography and the topographical bibliography, the Griffith Institute also houses an archive that contains like the collective memory, some life works of some of Egyptology's greatest scholars. So downstairs we have documents ranging from early travelers' accounts, we have scholarly papers, paintings, watercolors, squeezes and rubbings, early photography, negatives and slides, and perhaps, let's say, the most famous documents in our collection are probably the original records that were produced by Howard Carter and his team when they excavated the tomb of Tutankhamun. And so in my lecture today, it is through the lens of these records that we actually look at what I would call probably the most famous discovery in archaeology. And I thought, let's just start very briefly with an introduction. So Tutankhamun died around 1320 BC and was then buried in the Valley of the Kings near Luxor in the south of Egypt. He had come to the throne as a child after a period of religious, of political changes, and then his unexpected death at probably the age of 19 meant that his burial had to be prepared quite hastily and in a small reused tomb. And then after his funeral, the tomb was hidden by construction works of later royal tombs nearby. Altogether, the room consisted of 4 rooms and really proved to be packed with almost 6,000 objects. Among them, a wealth of ritual items that were specifically prepared for the burial, like the coffins, the sarcophagus, of course also the famous mask, and the beautiful canopic shrine, which you see here in the background of this image. And there was also a wealth of everyday objects from the king's daily life. So you find everything from clothes to jewelry, cosmetic equipment, writing equipment, weapons, furniture, even food provisions. And so, yes, what you see under the bed is what I always refer to as Tupperware boxes. This is where food provisions were stored. And all of these objects were extremely well preserved thanks to the very dry conditions in the desert valley. And so it was in autumn 1922, as Egypt had just started to become an independent nation, that the tomb was discovered by Howard Carter, who was excavating in the Valley of the Kings on a concession that was granted to Lord Carnarvon, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, given to him by the Egyptian authorities. the discovery of the tomb is, I think, undoubtedly one of the most famous events in the history of archaeology, and it very, very quickly turned into a media sensation, which is not a surprise given that it was basically until then the only royal burial from ancient Egypt that was discovered more or less, let's say, substantially intact. And then clearing and recording the tomb and its contents, also including the conservation of the objects and then their transport to the Egyptian Museum in Cairo at Tahrir Square, took Carter and his team solid 10 years and only finished in January 1933. So, and then 7 years later, Howard Carter died in March 1939. He had never married, he had no children, so he bequeathed most of his estates, including the archaeological records, to his famous niece, a woman called Phyllis Walker. You see here on the left, together with her uncle, she joined him for one winter season in Egypt in 1931. Phyllis was not an Egyptologist, so she wasn't sure what to do with the records, but she was very aware of the fact that they're really unique records. So she then contacted two Egyptologists in Oxford who had been members of the team, Ellen Gardiner and Percy Newberry, and asked for their advice, what to do with this material. And they suggested to give it to the Griffith Institute, which at this point had just been newly founded, quickly became the center of Egyptology here. One of the reasons for suggesting Oxford was that they actually wanted to work on a proper academic publication. So Carter had only managed to complete a best-selling, but only preliminary 3-volume popular book on the discovery of the tomb. He had originally planned a 6-volume academic publication, but that was a burden for him that he was just incapable of fulfilling. So when he died, some Oxfordian colleagues wanted to take over this colossal task, and of course, they needed access to the excavation records. Another reason for the archive coming to Oxford was that we're obviously talking about summer 1939 here, and the war with Germany was already imminent. So it was clear Oxford would be a much, much safer place than London. And so the vast majority of the material was then sent as a protective deposit to Oxford in August 1939, away from the dangers of London. And then in 1946, Phyllis officially donated the documentation with its associated copyright to the Griffith Institute. And she did this, and I quote her here, as a memorial to my uncle and his work. Until today, the collection is stored in the archive of the Griffith Institute, preserving, at least in parts, its original arrangement by Howard Carter. And these records really represent a very astonishing corpus of archaeological records, giving us a very unique insight into the archaeological process, the discovery of the tomb, and then the subsequent work as it happened firsthand on an almost day-by-day basis. So the full Tutankhamun archive, as we call it here, consists literally of thousands of records. Among them, there are almost 50 maps and plans. There are almost 7,000 object cards with associated photographic prints. There are the records of the unwrapping and the examination of the king's mummified body. There are about 5,000 pages in writing, including Carter's personal diaries and his archaeological journals, his notes and drawings for the planned publication, also the so-called conservation logbooks, and notes that were made by the mission's conservator, a man called Alfred Lucas. And probably most famously, there are also about 12,000 original glass plate negatives. You see them on the left. On the top, the original negative, at the bottom, the print. And then on the right-hand side, there are also over 600 so-called magic lantern slides that are a bit like a smaller version of the original Burton glass plate negatives. And they were used by Howard Carter to illustrate his lectures. The lectures he gave on the tomb that also included two very punishing, but also two very successful lecture tours through Europe and North America. And so after this quick introduction, let's now have a closer look at the discovery which at least for Carter and Carnarvon started already 7 years earlier in 1915, when Lord Carnarvon signed the permission that allowed him to excavate in the Valley of the Kings. And then with a little delay due to the outbreak of the First World War, Carter started finally working in the Valley of the Kings in autumn 1917. And the process began with this beautiful map you can see here, created by Howard Carter, that shows you the area of the Valley of the Kings in Lord Carnarvon's concession, the eastern part of the valley, where over a penciled grid of reference squares, Carter plotted in all the known royal tombs, other features like wadis, and then he updated this map methodically as he worked along the valley floor, so excavating from the surface down to the bedrock to make sure to really not miss anything. However, for the first 5 years without much success. And in summer 1922, Lord Carnarvon was actually willing to give up, when Carter used this map to convince him to have one last season to clear the area you see here in the red square now, which was the last unexplored area on the map. And that was an area that in the past had been avoided by archaeologists because it was just next to the entrance to the room of Ramses VI, which was a massive tourist magnet. And, you know, archaeologists and tourists don't go together very well. So the solution for Carter was to start the excavation season a bit earlier, before the tourist season started, on the 1st of November 1922. And then only 3 days later, the success story already began. When on the 4th of November, Howard Carter wrote down in his diary that famous line saying, "First steps of tomb found." And as you can see, it's scribbled all over the page, which, by the way, is really the only time in, you know, the thousands of pages we have from Carter's handwriting that he's not staying in line. And I think this is basically the closest an Englishman could get to convey excitement and some kind of feeling. Instead of staying in the line, he scribbled that sentence all over the lines. So the first steps belong to a rock-cut stairway, which you see on the left-hand side, that was leading down to a plastered wall covered with stamped cartouches. Behind this lay a corridor, and then there was a second sealed doorway, the one you see on the right-hand side. And then it was finally on the 26th of November in 1922. The delay was due to the fact that Carnarvon had to travel from Egypt to Egypt from England, which, you know, in the old days you had to do by boat. So it took quite long. But then finally, on the 26th of November, Carter made a tiny breach into the second doorway and was the first person after more than 3,000 years to look into the tomb of Tutankhamun, or to be precise, into the first room, the so-called antechamber. And he recollects this moment in his excavation journal, describing it as, "It was some time before one could see. The hot air escaping caused the candle to flicker. But as soon as one's eyes became accustomed to the glimmer of light, the interior of the chamber gradually loomed before one, with its strange and wonderful medley of extraordinary and beautiful objects heaped upon one another. There was naturally short suspense for those present who could not see. When Lord Carnarvon said to me, 'Can you see anything?' I replied to him, 'Yes, it is wonderful.'" And I hope you realize it's not exactly the line most people have in mind when they think of the reply. We hear that Carter said, "Yes, I see wonderful things." But that's actually not true. That's what he later writes in his book, but not what he writes down on the same evening in the journal. So that very famous line in archaeology is most likely a fabrication. But that just on a side note. So Carter and Carnarvon very quickly realized the extent of their discovery and also the need to gather an international teams of experts together. And it was quite conveniently that already in the first days after the discovery, Carter received a congratulatory telegram from Albert Lisco, who was the first curator for Egyptian art in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, New York. Was also a member of the museum's excavation team in Thebes, so they were quite close by. And Lisco was offering Howard Carter any help that he might need in brackets, of course, also in the hope that the Metropolitan was hoping to also get some of the finds for their museum, of course. So 2 members of the Met joined Carter and Carnarvon, the photographer Harry Burton and a man called Arthur Mays, who was an assistant curator at the Met. And then the team was completed with Alfred Lucas, who was a chemist working for the Antiquities Service and was a specialist for ancient Egyptian materials and technologies and in charge of the conservation of the objects. There was a man called Arthur Callender, an engineer. And then there were various experts on specific find groups, like James Henry Breasted, who was in charge of the seals. There was Ellen Gardiner, who was a philologist and responsible for everything with an inscription. There was also Percy Newberry and his wife, Essie. They were both specialists for botanical remains and textiles. So here you see them working on Tutankhamun's linen pall. For the physical examination of the king's mummified body, 2 doctors joined the team in November 25. The Egyptian doctor, Saleh Behamdi, who was the former director of the Government School of Medicine in Cairo, and then Douglas Derry, who was professor for anatomy at the same school. And of course, in addition to the foreign specialists, Howard Carter also employed a large local Egyptian workforce, consisting of several skilled, very experienced Egyptian team members with whom he had worked together for many, many years, the so-called foremen, the Reis, and about 50 other local workmen, and of course, dozens of children, as it was kind of common practice back then. And the Egyptian team members, of course, also played a very crucial role in the discovery of the tomb. And in this context, one particular record I just wanted to show you because I find it so very touching is this series of 3 images of an Egyptian boy who wears one of Tutankhamun's necklaces. When the middle picture was first published in the Illustrated London News in 1927, it was actually described as that the picture had only been taken simply to show the method of suspension of the necklace at the back. But I think looking at the boy's face, his uneasy expression, you can see a much, much more complex human response. And I think you can really sense his awareness of the weight, both quite literally the physical weight of the necklace, but also metaphorically speaking, the weight of ancient history on his shoulders. And it is one of these rare moments where ancient and modern Egypt touch, and the past and the present are united. As of course they somehow always are in Egypt. And what I was wondering is, I think maybe the boy was chosen because he was about the same age as Tutankhamun when he died. But let's go back to the excavation. Between November 22 and February 1923, the team was mainly working in the first room, the so-called antechamber, and 2 outstanding objects probably everyone knows from this tomb were in this room the 2 so-called guardian statues who protected the sealed doorway in the partition wall between the antechamber and the burial chamber. So you see this is this little bit of the darker spot in the wall here. And then the big moment finally came in on the 16th of February 1923, when Howard Carter, Arthur Mays, and Lord Carnarvon, in front of about 20 invited guests, removed this partition wall and then entered the burial chamber that contained, of course, the 4 gilded shrines, inside the sarcophagus, and inside the 3 coffins and the king's body with the famous golden mask. And what you see here is probably one of my favorite records in the Tutankhamun archive. It's this beautiful plan of the burial chamber that Howard Carter made, where you see the shrines, the sarcophagus, the coffins, and then the king's body all nestled into each other, like a bit like a Russian doll concept. Now you see the burial chamber at the stage where the lid of the sarcophagus had been removed, and you basically look at the top of the outer coffin. And I think this plan is really outstanding in quality, as it, I think, really shows Carter's sense of precision, but at the same time also his remarkable artistry. The clearance of the tomb was such a long and difficult process, owing to not only the quantity, but also the variety and the fragility of some of the artifacts, which included, not only things made of gold and semi-precious stones, which is what a lot of people think of, but also a lot of fragile objects like painted wood. There were perfumed oils, there were animal and human remains, there were clothes. So yes, on the top left-hand side, you see Tutankhamun's underwear, but there were also cakes, fruits, even flowers, feathers. And what I would now like to talk about is that very, very meticulous process of documenting each and every one of these almost 6,000 objects, and kind of walk you through that process, how they did that. So as you can imagine, photography really played a major role, probably even the key role in the documentation of the tomb and its contents. And I think it really is fair to say that the mission's photographer, Harry Burton, produced some of the not only most famous, but also most compelling archaeological images that were ever made. Harry Burton decided to take his photographs on glass plate negatives that were coated with a silver and gelatine emulsion, and then he stored them in tin plate canisters that you see at the background that were labeled sensitive to light. Then in a first step, Burton would always take 2 images of a room or a corner of a room, an area of a room, one showing all the objects as they were discovered in situ, and then another image after little numbered cards had been placed next to each object, assigning them with a very specific reference number that were given to them by Howard Carter. And what you see here, the room is the so-called annex, a little small storeroom of the antechamber. And of course, that step was necessary before removing the artifacts from the tomb, as of course, when you remove an object, you isolate it. You will destroy the archaeological context, the position of the object in that case. So that context will be forever lost, but it is preserved to the photographs. And then you will always be able to reconstruct it with the help of these images. The objects were then packed and transported to a tomb nearby, the tomb of Seti II, which was given over to the team by the Egyptian authorities, and which also served as a photographic studio and a conservation studio, where Arthur Mace and Alfred Lucas were very busy at work. Here you see the 2 men working on one of the 2 guardian statues. So if necessary, Alfred Lucas would carry out cleaning and conservation work, like applying adhesives and coating and writing down all his measures and his observations in his so-called conservation logbooks, one for each excavation season, and then very often adding additional information on materials, technologies. And what you see here is 1 page of his many notes on the king's outer coffin. And by the way, Carter later commented that without their intervention, not 1/10 of the objects would ever have reached the Cairo Museum in any reasonable form of condition. Then, following the process of cleaning the objects, Burton took another set of object pictures, the so-called studio photographs. And I'm using as an example this little object, which is actually my favorite object from the tomb. It's number 579, an alabaster vase in the shape of a lion discovered in the annex. And then later on, what you see here are all the 4 so-called studio photographs that Burton took of that vessel from all possible angles. In addition to the photographs and the notes that Carter wrote down in his excavation journals, every object was also documented in a series of so-called record or object cards. And what you see here are 4 out of the altogether 10 record cards of one very famous object, Tutankhamun's golden throne, which you see in the middle. And these cards were made by the various team members reflecting their respective expertise. So Howard Carter would always start recording the basic information like the find spot, the dimensions of an object. You would make a description. Sometimes you have additional sketches and drawings on these cards. Alfred Lucas, that's his handwriting, always provided additional information on the conservation measures. You see here on the top, the treatment of the throne, while Alan Gardiner copied the hieroglyphs. And so on this card, for instance, he notes a tiny but a very, very important historical detail that the king's name on the throne was originally Tutankhamun. It was then altered later on to Tutankhamun. And of course, this change happened when Tutankhamun restored the traditional god Amun after his father's period of, let's call it, religious revolution. And then for some items, Howard Carter even annotated some of Burton's photographic prints. So again, here you see 1 out of 4 of these annotated prints with Carter's really tiny, tiny handwriting, writing down more information on material, but also in particular on the colors, because he was, very aware of the fact that, of course, Harry Burton's photographs are all in black and white. And I thought just an interesting aspect I want to mention on a side note, while talking about photography, the vast majority of the photographs that Harry Burton took of the tomb are, of course, archaeological records, the in situ pictures, the studio photographs, but he also took photos for press purposes. And the background story here is that Lord Carnarvon had signed an exclusive deal with the Times. So only the Times got these official images and were allowed to reproduce them. And so in this way, the archaeologists really had the opportunity to kind of show themselves in the way how they wanted to be perceived. So that is maybe a very early example for a very clever media policy. And what we have here are 2 examples of these types of images that the Times wanted: people in action, significant moments like opening the doors of the 4th shrine and then seeing the sarcophagus for the first time. And all of these images were, of course, staged and were carefully crafted by Harry Burton. And just one more example, so this kind of creation of press image did not only influence photography of certain people or objects, but even of rooms. And the example you see here is an archaeological photograph versus a publicity shot. So here are 2 very different images of the so-called treasury with the famous Anubis statue on a shrine. Both pictures are taken more or less from the same spot, in the same angle. But one is shown, it's lit from the main burial chamber, standard archaeological image, as I would call it, whereas the other one is rather Gothic. Now you have a hidden light source, really producing a highly dramatic and mysterious effect and spotlighting the spectacular the Anubis and also the shrine in the background. And this is, of course, the type of image that was reproduced in the Times. And indeed, it is still until today one of the most asked for images by press. But let's go back to the excavation process, more or less to finish it off. At the end of each season, the conserved objects were boxed and then packed into crates, and these were transported from the Valley of the Kings by a portable railway system to the Nile. So it was a distance about 5 miles, and then these crates were loaded on a barge that carried the crates over, it's about 400 miles from Luxor to Cairo, a journey that back then took about 6 days. And then in Cairo, a selection of the objects was put on immediate display in the Egyptian Museum at Tahrir Square, which became the permanent home of the objects until, one day soon, hopefully, we've all been waiting for this day for years. The Grand Egyptian Museum will, of course, be the new home of all the finds from the tomb of Tutankhamun. So fingers crossed it happens soon. One very special event of really huge, outstanding excitement was, of course, the unwrapping of the king's mummified body. And I chose to include that special moment in my lecture, not only as it was, of course, such a highlight of the whole archaeological process, the whole excavation, but also as Howard Carter, as part of this autopsy, produced some of his really most stunning, in my opinion, the most stunning records of the whole archive. So the unwrapping and the examination of the body was carried out by a committee of experts in November 25. It had taken them so long to really clean the antechamber and then make it to the king's body. And that committee consisted of course, Howard Carter, also Pierre Lacour, who was the director of the Egyptian Antiquities Service. There were more representatives of the Egyptian authorities, the two doctors I've already mentioned before, the Egyptian medic, Dr. Salah Hamdi, and then the British surgeon, Douglas Derry. And over the course of 9 days, more than 150 objects were discovered that had been placed within the linen bandages of the mummified body. Among them, amulets, bracelets, pectorals, collars, even 2 daggers and little golden stalls for the king's fingertips and his toes. And to document the position of each object within the mummy wrapping, before removing them, these images were, of course, again recorded through Harry Burton's photographs, while Howard Carter produced this really stunning set of records, the so-called autopsy drawings. There are altogether 18 of them. So here is the image and the drawing of some of the bracelets that were found on the king's forearm. And just to show you 2 more of these amazing autopsy drawings, because I can't help it. On the left-hand side, you see one of the drawings with 2 golden pectorals, one with 3 scarabs, and then one in the shape of the vulture goddess Nekhbet. And on the right-hand side, a drawing with 3 pectorals, the Eye of Horus on top, then on the left, the winged falcon, and on the right, a winged scarab. And then once removed, Harry Burton took more images of the photographs in his studio, while Howard Carter produced additional archaeological sketches and drawings of the artifact. So what you see here is one of the 2 daggers that were discovered on the king's body, the dagger made of gold and glass. On the top left, you have Carter's, and the bottom right, you have 2 of Howard Carter's archaeological drawings, and in the middle, one more of Harry Burton's studio images. The autopsy was more or less the last high-profile event that was extensively covered by the press. And then in the last years of the excavation, the public and media interest dwindled, and the task to record and clear the tomb, including the restoration of the objects, was, as I said, finally finished in January 1933. And what you see here is one of the very last pictures that were taken by Harry Burton, an image of the sarcophagus, which until today remains in the Valley of the Kings, together with the king's body. And with this, my lecture comes to an end. I'd like to finish by just mentioning our Tutankhamun archive is online, freely available. It was started in the late 90s, so we were quite early, and then the database was finished in 2011. It is a free open access database. So in case you really got interested today, all of these thousands of records we have, you can have a look at them on our website. And I just, on a very last note, I wanted to say, of course, this database is a bit outdated by now. It really needs urgent upgrading. You know, in the world of IT, 13 years is ages. So at the moment, we're fundraising to revamp the website. What you see here are like 2 stills from a promotional video that we produced together with an IT developing company here in Oxford. So our vision is to create a spatial archive where you can move through a 3-dimensional version of the tomb, entirely built on the basis of Harry Burton's photographs. And then you will be able to go into the tomb and see it as it was found, with all the objects in situ. And then the idea is that you can click on objects like what you see here, And then you would see all the records referring to that specific objects and then presented in this kind of interrelated way. So this is something we are quite looking forward to. So wish us luck, and I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much for such an amazing lecture, Daniela. Yeah, thank you for contextualizing Carter's archive, for the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb and why it's there at the Griffith Institute, and sharing a snapshot of such a vast collection, which I think has given us all a deeper understanding of the tomb's discovery, its excavation, and yeah, some of the subsequent marketing. So thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
All that is left for me to say is a huge thank you to Daniela for such an interesting talk. And many people in the chat have said they will be off to visit the Griffith Institute website and the Tutankhamun archive. And I highly recommend that you do if you're catching up or watching now. Thank you very much, Daniela.
Thanks for inviting me. I enjoyed it very much. So you all have a good day.
Thank you. And we will follow that hopeful project to bring the website
yes.
alive.
There will be an announcement hopefully soon. Definitely all summer.
Great. Watch this space. Thanks, everyone, and hopefully see you at another EES event soon. Bye, everyone.
Ciao.